Okay guys, so I've got the meat unwrapped, and one thing you're going to want to do when you unwrap it is rinse it. It might have a little bit of an odor to it. It's perfectly okay. I mean, if it smells rancid, it's probably rancid, but odds are it's not. It's just got a little bit of that funky beef odor to it. Spray it off, gets rid of 90% of that odor. Anyway, so this is what it looks like out of the package, and we just go to town from here. You got a pretty thick fat cap on the top side of it, so I always just start in on the top and I just cut that fat off of there. As you can see, I mean, this is like 1.5 inches thick, and I'm still just into fat. It used to really bother me that I was losing all this weight to fat until I started processing pepperoni, and then I knew I could add that meat into my pepperoni and not lose all that money. So I don't really make much off of it in that regard, but I don't lose it either. So what I always try to do is if I find a big chunk that I cut out that's got a big chunk of meat in it, I'll trim that out right away so I'm not throwing a whole bunch of meat into my fat. I mean, the whole project, the whole idea here is to make jerky, not to make fat for pepperoni. So, anyway, I'm going to keep cutting this up, and I'll be back to show you what it looks like once it's all cut up. Oh, actually, before I do that, I'm going to take this cap off of here so you guys can see what that looks like real quick. Any of this meat that's on top that's dark and hard, I just cut it off, throw it in with my fat. It's not that big of a deal. I try to make a quality product, and part of that means that I give up a little bit more waste. No big deal. And also, it's time consuming cutting this stuff up, especially cutting it up by hand. So I had to take a look at my bottom line and see what was better. Am I better being super picky, or am I more cost effective and time savings and just cutting it off and not dealing with it? So come to find out that I'm way more efficient by just cutting it off and not dealing with it. Anyway, don't be scared to just turn this however you need to. We're getting down to the meat now. Okay, so right here, this is the cap, and basically what I do is I use my thumb and I find a way to separate between these fat layers, and I just get in here with my knife and I start making little cuts, and you'll see as you're doing this that the fat and the meat and the fat layer will separate from the fat layer below it. It's really kind of neat how it just kind of comes apart in the way that it's meant to come apart. So then when we're done with this, you'll see in just a second I'll have two completely separate pieces of the meat. And if you do this often enough, you'll learn and see that there are actually lines that you cut along. That basically, this piece of meat tells you what and where to cut. Super easy. So this looks like one piece. I actually have two separate pieces right here. And there's this fat line right here actually separates the flank from whatever this little cut is called. I don't know what it's called. I'm not a butcher. So I just get in here and I make that cut. Got two nice clean pieces there. Boom. I just throw them off to the side for right now. I cut everything down and break it down into smaller pieces, and then I slice the jerky meat as I go. So I'm gonna break the rest of this down. I'll be back with you once I get it all broke down. Hey guys, so I got it broke down. I got the flank, or that flap, the cap they call it. Basically I got 1, 2, 3, 4 large size pieces. This is more or less the eye of the round. This is your roast, and I don't know what the hell this one is. Anyway, so how I cut them up, I got a pretty simple, easy method. I do everything by hand. If you got a slicer and you want to use a slicer, you can feel more than free to do it. But I just think I feel it gives it a little bit more personal touch, and there's also no, I can turn the meat and I can check it and look at it every way I turn it. So anyway, the big one, I cut into thirds this way first. And then I take the bottom, the tail piece of that, and I cut it in half this way. If you're not good at this, be very, very careful cutting like that. You might want to turn it up on end and cut it downwards. And if you notice, when I cut this, I take my hand, curl my fingers in, curl my thumb in. That way, if I do cut myself, I'm cutting a knuckle, or I'm cutting across the top of the skin instead of cutting down into the hand. So anyway, curl your fingers, make your cut. Do that with all 3 of those slices I cut off. This one's still got a little bit. I'm going to trim it off now. It's easier to do trim when it's in a big chunk. They say it's easier to do this stuff when it's partially frozen. I always seem to miss the mark and get it a little bit too frozen, so I just cut it raw. I've learned how to do it, and I've cut thousands of pounds of meat like this. So anyway, once again, thirds. So if you notice, what this does is it gives me very uniform sizes of meat. And what that does, when I start cutting up the actual strips of jerky meat, it gives me very uniform sizes of jerky meat. So this one, that's the roast piece, cut it in half this way, and I cut each one of those in half as well. I'm showing you the safe way to cut it, so you don't try and do anything silly. This is a little out of my realm of how I normally do it, but you can also take your hand and go over the top of your knife, and as long as you're cutting straight and slow, you can make a nice safe cut that way as well. And then my eye, this is actually the eye. I was wrong. Imagine that. Anyway, I'm going to cut this into thirds. And then I'm going to cut each one of those into halves. If you're doing it like this, you want that blade flat. Put pressure down on the meat. And I mean pressure. What that does is that allows the meat to cut through a little more evenly. You're not pulling, you're not dragging. And also, your hand, as you're cutting through, your hand will naturally want to do this number and go downwards. So as you're cutting through, kind of give it just a little bit of an upward twist on that knife blade, and you won't have that issue. So now I have a whole bunch of meat that's getting ready, that is now ready to cut up into jerky strips. And I also have this piece, that flank piece. It's got a little bit of fat left on it still. I don't get real super concerned about that because I think a little bit of fat adds a little bit of flavor. So anyway, I just cut this and then once again curl them fingers in. This is probably the hardest piece to cut and get good strips out of because it's got the most gelatinous movement to it. So there's a big word from this guy, gelatinous. Anyway, and I'm cutting about a 1/4 inch thickness, maybe a little bit more, maybe closer to 3/8. I just kind of watch the meat as I'm cutting through it. Sometimes you need to guide that knife one way or another, depending on which way the meat is pulling on you. And like this, I started getting a little long on my strips here, so I'm simply just gonna turn the meat. I've already got the thickness I want, so I don't have to worry about thickness. And it's literally just, and I just kind of give the knife a little flick to knock the meat off of it. Once again, I'm turning it. I don't want little short, tiny little pieces if I can at all avoid it. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but I'm looking for ease of tomorrow when I go to put it on the racks and put it in the smoker, just to try to make my life as easy as possible. So those little pieces are kind of a pain in the ass. There's no two ways about it. Okay, so that's all cut up into the good bin. Remember which bin's which. I've done that many times. And then I just grab my jerky meat, and you can cut this. The grain runs this way, okay? You can cut it with the grain, you can cut it against the grain. If you cut it against the grain, you're gonna get, it's gonna be a little harder to cut. It's gonna make a little more tender of a piece of meat. If you cut it with the grain, it's gonna cut a lot easier. It's gonna make a slightly more chewy piece of jerky. So it just kind of depends on what you want, really. Anyway, these are what the strips look like. About yay thick or so. It just takes practice. I kind of came by it naturally. I've always been good with cutting stuff up. I've always been good with seasoning and all that stuff. So, when you get to this last little piece, I always just really careful. I grab it by the outsides and I just drag my knife right through it. Just be real careful. Anyway, I'm gonna cut the rest of this up. This is 1 of 5 I gotta do today, so when I get ready to start seasoning some stuff up, I'll give you another shot on about that.